Hello and welcome to another episode of the Coaching Outdoors podcast. I am Anna Marie. You're one of your co-hosts for the day, and I am joined by Paul Jeffries. And our guest today, Tom, has been on our radar for a while, and I'm sure that any regular listeners are fully aware is that we do keep an active eye of what is going on in the outdoor coaching and nature connected worlds. And there's so many people doing amazing work. So we do have a little bit of a hit list. And Tom has been on our hit list for a while, and we're delighted to be able to carve out the time and space today for a conversation, which I truly believe is going to be absolutely fascinating. So enough from me. Let us get going. Tom, please introduce yourself. Keep it brief. We have got time to go into the details later.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Anna Marie. So, yeah, my name is Tom Goldstein. I would say that I am an ex-engineer or a recovering engineer. And so now I am a coach, a vision quest guide, a sound therapist, a mountain leader, and a Qigong teacher. I work with a really wide range of clients, both individuals and teams. And I grew up in London, and I've been living for the past 14 years in Chamonix in the French Alps.
It's great to have you on, Tom, and thank you for joining us today. Both Anna Marie and I we both know Tom, and it's really exciting to have you on. And without further ado, Tom, we're going to start with our favourite question that all of our listeners love to hear the answers. And so there's two parts to the question. The first part, what is your earliest memory of being outdoors? And then, not forgetting the second part, why do you love the outdoors so much?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And it's a real pleasure to be here and talking about nature. So, yeah, I said that I grew up in London, but I was lucky enough to, from a really young age, to spend a lot of time in the countryside in Norfolk, both in a really rural area and on the coast. And those are probably my earliest memories of being in nature. Running around the forests and the woodlands and the fields and up and down the rivers and just playing and being out in nature. Thinking back, it seems like it was, endless days of being out. So those are my earliest memories, really. And some of them were me alone playing, and some were there was a kind of a neighbor's kid of where we used to stay, and just making forts out of hay bales and that kind of thing. And so I guess what I really love about nature back then, I think there was a real element of the imaginal, that we could bring into our lives being out in nature as well, and build it into what we were doing. But I think if I go a bit further than that, there's something about the freedom of being out in nature, the sense of maybe peace and connection as well. I notice that it can be really loud when I'm out in nature with animals and birds and whatever it is, and wind, but there's a certain peace to that I find very different to when I'm in a city or in an urban environment.
And I can really resonate with that sense of freedom that you talk about. That for me is something that it's visceral. Like being outdoors in nature is a different embodied lived experience as opposed to being in a box. And thinking about where you are now and back to those early days, just from a career perspective, how have you ended up where you are now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's two main tracks, or maybe three main tracks to my life. So I was always very good at science subjects and maths and things like that at school. And I used to really enjoy tinkering with computers. So back in the kind of 80s, when computers were kind of new at home, I enjoyed trying to figure out how they worked and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think naturally, with that leaning at school and that interest, that took me into the world of engineering. And so I studied a master's in engineering at the University of Bristol. It was a natural progression then to go on into an engineering degree. And I spent 15 years working in telecoms. And a lot of that time was actually solving difficult problems. That's something that I really enjoyed. And as I came towards the end of that career, the last 5 years of those 15 years, but I was in leadership positions. And I started to find that I had more interest actually in the people than in the technology itself. And then in 2015, I asked myself the kind of tricky question of, is this still what I want to be doing in 10 years' time? And my answer was honestly no. So my decision at that point was, okay, if I want to be doing what I want to be doing in 10 years' time, which is funnily enough this year, actually, 2025, I need to make a major shift. And so that's what I did. So I quit that career. I didn't really know what I was going to do next, but I did have this interest in coaching. And so I did my coach training with CTI, and that then opened up this whole new path. So I went back to university. I studied a master's in psychology and a postgraduate diploma in behavior change. And I've been building my coaching practice ever since. The third strand is, I think, the deeper, more spiritual aspect of what I do and how I show up. So when I first moved to Chamonix in 2011, I actually accidentally ended up on a silent meditation retreat. It was the first time I'd ever done anything like that in my life. And that, again, that opened up a whole new path for me. So I went with an amazing teacher, a guy who calls himself Bergs, who's based in the UK, and got a very good grounding in kind of Buddhist Dzogchen meditation. And then at the same point that I left that career in engineering, I actually went on a long retreat with Bergs in the Pyrenees and happened to read a book. I think it was called Vision Quest by Tom Brown Jr. And when I was in that open state and we were in this amazing natural place, in the Pyrenees, it just opened up my mind and my heart to connection with nature. And so that also then allowed me to move down this path of nature connection and eventually opening up into Vision Quest, which is what I'm really, really interested in right now.
That's great, Tom. Thank you. And I mean, just listening to you just, go through that timeline, as it were. And I think what's always comes to me, and I think many listeners, is just how much of an inquiring mind. That's what I've written. That's the sort of the theme that comes out for me when I listen to that, your timeline is that whether we look at computers and that scientific nature, you were already inquiring, even at that younger age. And then it becomes people and you're inquiring, and that spirituality in the third strand, with Bergs and Tom Brown and so on. And I think many of our listeners will really identify with that. And I think it's really lovely to hear that timeline that you've just discussed and how that mind of yours inquires constantly. And I think that, segues beautifully into the next question that I have for you is that how does all that sort of engineering, I guess, inquiring mind world, how do you bring that into your coaching?
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Paul. I really like that way you've put that inquiring mind. I was having a sit down before we started recording this today, and I was just sort of looking out of the window, and the idea of being a life explorer somehow came up for me. And I think you're right. In that has shown up through my whole life, whether it was with computers when I was younger or in my engineering career or now as a coach. And there's something about engineering that on the one hand has to be very rational and very precise. Whether you're building a computer or a bridge, it has to do what it's supposed to do. And at the same time, there's a lot of, I'd say, focus on exploring the situation and the context. So if we think about these two ways of operating, either divergent, where we're looking at more and more possibilities, we're exploring, we're opening up, and then convergent, where we come to the solution and we have a kind of a specific outcome. In engineering, there's a real consciousness, I think, about which of those phases we're in. And the divergent phase allowed me as an engineer to really explore what is the reality here? What have I not seen? What are the tools that are possible? What are we really trying to achieve? So that then we can move down this convergent path of getting to a bridge that stays up or a computer that works. And I find it's the same. You're working with people. It can be too easy to move into outcomes too quickly, but it can equally be too easy to stay in that divergent exploring phase sort of forever. And co-creating that with, when I was in the engineering world with colleagues, and now in the coaching world with the clients that I work with, I feel that that's where there's a real crossover. I also find that something about my engineering mind often tries to bring me into the optimal. So there's a lot of different tools out there and a lot of different ways that we can work as coaches. Some of those involve being out in nature and some don't. And I'm always trying to figure out and work with my clients to understand, well, what is the most optimal approach? What is the best tool for this person in this situation with what it is they're trying to achieve? And I guess that is probably also comes from my engineering brain and my engineering experience.
And hearing you talk, it's really reminding me of the phrase like the science and art of coaching. And it's that fluidity to be able to dance in the moment and really draw from both of these areas. And that in itself, it's not linear. It's not a binary. It's very much that fluidity and that organicness. And that's what, I've always enjoyed the conversations that we've had when we've met up in Chamonix over a coffee and just really making sure that, okay, well, what is the evidence? Like, what is the science? Like, what is the proof to appease the mind? And then actually going deeper and really seeing you go on this depth, this spiritual journey. And we'll be touching more on that later. And ultimately, it's all about learning. Coaches, there definitely seems to be a theme there with the love for learning, a quest. It is that inquiring mind and inquiring body and within the system as well, just taking that a little bit further. And you've mentioned a couple of courses already that have supported your development, as a coach, as a human being, and to discover maybe a couple more. What's really shaped your work, whether it's a program, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a mentor? It would be great to know.
Yeah, beautiful, Anna Marie. I want to touch as well on that, the art and the science piece before I get into some of the kind of influences and experiences that I've had that really supported me. When I was younger, I was really terrible at art, right? In the classic sense of drawing or painting or that kind of thing. And what I realize now is that art is so much more broad than that, actually, and that I think we all have art in us. And so, I grew up focusing on my scientific mind, but now that the art piece of coaching I think is really important to me. And I really enjoy the process of showing up in both the science and the art of coaching. And I think that it's really important that we ask ourselves the questions of is this working, and is there evidence for it, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's a study being done and there's an evidence base and all of that. I get why that's important, but fundamentally I think it's just important that we check in. Is what I'm doing working for me? Is what I'm doing working for my client? Is what they're doing working for them? And that's as much evidence base as having journal articles published in wherever it is, in my experience anyway. So coming on to the question of mentors and guides and teachers, so there's probably two other teachers that I'd really like to mention. So one is a guy called Sal Gancarelli, who's based out in the US, and he was my first step into nature connection, really. He runs an amazing organization called Helpers Mentoring Society, and it was with him that I did my first quest. That was a kind of an overnight quest with a fire, and through his kind of guidance and mentoring over a few years, allowed me to kind of drop into a much deeper connection to nature, and also to the idea of sitting with questions and being with intention. So he was fundamental in my path along the nature connection route, as has been a guy called John P. Milton, who's based in Crestone, again in the US, in Colorado, who runs an organization called Way of Nature. So his whole focus is about us going out into nature on solos and being in relationship with what he calls the three natures. So our inner nature, outer nature, and then true nature, which we can talk about as spiritual or great mystery or consciousness. So those have been, I guess, my main teachers in terms of really deepening my work. In terms of tools and courses, because I've done a lot of professional development, I think, like a lot of coaches, we do. It's difficult to stop, I find. And so for me, the most powerful of those, I can't necessarily think of a specific course or teacher, but all of the learning I've done around parts work, I found extremely useful, both on my own journey and in supporting clients. So an example of that is internal family systems, and somatic work, because it was so easy for me when I was younger to just stay in my head, and until I was able to drop into my body and anchor learning and connection and awareness somatically as well as cognitively. Yeah, I think I was just missing 90% of the picture, to be honest. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And look, I think without a shadow, that's really a great answer comprehensively, because again, it feels as we move to talking about Vision Quest, it just feels as though many things have led you to a path that and that I can see with your comment where overnight you sat with questions with intention, but to do that you need to understand that somatic work, the anchoring, the body work, and it just feels that whilst you're right, many coaches, we go on this lifelong journey of learning, but it feels as though many of that much of that has led you to the path of your vision questing and the work you're doing, and I think that leads us nicely to could we start to explore and unpack that part of Vision Quest, which I know many of our listeners and watchers will be keen to hear about. So would you be able to share some insights into the experience that's changed you as a human being and as a coach? I mean, if we start there first, perhaps, and then we can open it up.
Yeah, and of course, this is such a big question. It's maybe a little difficult to find all the words, in the time that we have, and
Sure.
try and talk about all the pieces that I think are important. The first thing that's coming to mind is that the Vision Quest has given me a chance to spend quality time, because we're talking 4 days and 4 nights for typically that's what a traditional Vision Quest is, certainly in some cultures. So that amount of time where I'm also fasting, so I'm allowing my system to kind of clear itself out and to open up. By day 3, day 4, a lot of the busy mind has quietened down, and there's just the energy left is the energy just to be present, but to be out in really wild nature. And what I found over the sort of years of connecting with this practice and going out on quests is that even having a small object, which is human made. So, as an example, I can remember I was sitting in a field, a meadow, a kind of prairie, and I had this small camp chair, and it was in my field of vision. And when I removed that, there was a fundamental shift in my experience of being in that place. And, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's almost as though there's a deep, deep part of my brain that recognizes real wild nature, which is sort of untarnished by human development. And that in that place, something very different shows up within me. And so the Vision Quest has given me the opportunity to spend time in that environment. And I think that has shifted me, whether it's rewired my brain or helped me let go of kind of stuff that's held in my body. I don't know. And then if I come to maybe a more structured analysis of what is it that I've got out of Vision Quest, a lot of the focus is on being in relationship. I think with any nature connection, it's about being in relationship. And by practicing that consciously, in a relationship to myself, in relationship to nature around me, it's helped me, it's developed my ability just to be in relationship. And actually, one of the key tenets of Vision Quest is intention and question holding. So going out with an intention and going out with a question, and understanding that we are in relationship to that intention and that question. So it's not like we're trying to actually do something with it or think about the answer, or it's how do I remain in relationship to my intention and to my question and allow whatever comes up to come up, simply by being out there. And the next thing that's coming up in my mind is around the interaction between setting the container, so having structure and a level of control, let's say, and leaving space for the magic to occur. And I think that's something I've really learned, because Vision Quest effectively is a ceremony. It's a ritual space. So it's actually very important to set a strong container around that, a container of space. This is where I'm going to be, and time, it starts now and it ends then. And, the process of going into that time and space and coming back out of it, and having a really good structure around that. But then when I'm in that space, letting go completely of all structure and just allowing the magic to happen. And I think there's something really empowering about that. In a lot of scenarios, even if we go to the scenario of at work, when people understand where their responsibility is and where it ends, and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, but they can do whatever they want within that, people tend to be much more empowered than if they're either micromanaged or they actually have no idea where the limits really are. Yeah, so those are some of the things I think that that came up for me in answer to your question.
And within the vision quests, just almost circling back to the conversations we were having before about art and science, and whether you're listening in and what you know about vision quests already and how they unfold, and well, what is the science, what is the art, what is the spiritual and the more symbolic piece, and how then does that fit with the more scientific and rational mind? So very much this kind of, it could be a juxtapose, it could be, how does it make sense? So for you, how do you hold that potential anomaly?
So I am in a very different place today than I was, let's say, 4 years ago, and very, very different to where I was 10 years ago. I talked about in my career evolution of moving from this kind of more scientific engineering focus, where my skeptical mind was very useful, to a kind of a more spiritual and deeper and more somatic, more heart open place, actually, where the skeptical mind is still useful, but it needs to be just a voice in the whole field. So I think when I first started this nature connection journey, which was probably before I'd even heard of Vision Quest, I would often sort of pick the parts that I was willing to hear and engage with, which were the parts that made more rational sense to me. And I would kind of smile and nod when teachers were talking about the more spiritual and the deeper side of things. I think I was already on my spiritual journey, but there's still a lot of stuff that I found difficult to grasp and fit into my worldview. And what's happened for me over time is that I've had the immersive experiences that show me that actually, whatever the story is we put around this, there is fundamentally something true and deep happening when, for example, I'm out in nature for 4 days and 4 nights fasting. And that the impact that has on me, those kind of deeper immersive experiences, tend to shift me much more than actually the kind of more rational or scientific tools that I had been used to using, and that maybe are used in kind of business, that stay at the rational level and the surface level, that give us a lot of really helpful insights and maybe guide us on our journey, but they don't fundamentally, in my experience, shift us to a new way of showing up, which I think the Vision Quest and other really deep processes like that really can do.
That's great, Tom. And I think for many of our listeners, they will really identify with that journey and movement. We're all on a journey of that connection, particularly coaches and so on. And I bring back your answer to that the art answer you gave earlier of it's about being and showing up. And I think sometimes as coaches, we maybe turn up obviously with our rational mind, but it's being in the moment and knowing who we are. And there's something about that deeper journey that you're discussing there, that you've transitioned through in those 10 years. And it gives me curiosity for my own journey. I mean, and it's interesting. Your lifelong learning for me brings up is some of this work, you're a pathfinder. You're heading into some stuff that can help other people to follow and lead into. And there's something really lovely about that thought process. But I think that's a great answer to that rational versus deeper and long-lasting legacy. So I'm really curious to understand, what is the secret to Vision Quest? It's a simple question, but is there a secret, Tom, opening it up?
So it's an interesting word, secret, isn't it, actually? And it makes me think in a lot of the Taoist teachings, actually, which show up in Qigong and some of these other practices, that the word secret is often used, but not really to mean secret, but to mean more hidden, less obviously accessible. And I think that's really important, probably as a doorway into this question. We were just talking about, the deeper processes versus the more surface level processes. And one of the really important aspects in Vision Quest is the preparation phase, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the phases in a while. That preparation phase covers two main areas. So one is the practical aspects, because somebody's going to be going out for 4 days and 4 nights into wild nature, on their own. So there's isolation there, without food, with very minimal shelter. And that brings up, some real practical questions about what happens if it rains, and what happens if an animal shows up. So some of the kind of secret sauce, if you like, is treading this path carefully between making it a really deep experience, which is a real adventure for somebody, which actually takes them close to their edge. Traditionally, these vision quests were a kind of a rite of passage, or that was certainly one of the uses for them. So in that mode of being a rite of passage, there is this idea that something within us needs to die to make space for what comes next. And to make that really real, for our ego mind to really let go, there needs to be this almost this kind of belief that I could die out here. And of course, the way we set it up is that we make sure that it's safe and that isn't going to happen. And we need to balance that with, I'm really, stepping out of my comfort zone here. So one of the important aspects is that practical preparation for people, and getting that right depending on their individual and their experience. And the other side of the preparation is more around the intention setting and the question that they're going to go out with, and really identifying where somebody is in their life at the moment, and therefore why are they going out to do this quest. And that's often quite a long process before the quest begins, when somebody's decided that they want to go out and do this. Perhaps is starting to explore why, and what is the question that they really want to be in relationship with. So I think that's important for a vision quest. I also think that it can be easy to go out and do something like this and just spend our whole time in our heads, thinking about all of the stuff that's going on in our life. It can often bring up kind of quite a lot of difficult emotions and thoughts when we're out in a kind of a challenging environment or experience. And so I think one of the reasons that the Vision Quest goes deep is that it brings up a lot of shadow. It brings up a lot of blind spots. And so supporting somebody to explore that and to at least have some recognition of what might come up when they're out there on their own, and to do that in a really safe way, with the guide and often with a group actually in preparation again is really important. I'd say there's probably two other things that are really important to a vision quest. One is, for me anyway, is for the nature, the place, to be as wild as possible. I talked about earlier how when there's human-made environment, it somehow doesn't, or certainly in my experience, doesn't allow me to drop as deeply into the experience. As human beings, we tend to create things that are static, that are kind of sterile. The process of creation is amazing, but then once something is created, it's there, it is, until it kind of erodes or dissolves away. And whereas nature is continually changing, and that's fundamentally important, I think, to be in that environment, constant change and constant interaction. And then the final piece is around giving people practices to be in relationship to themselves and to nature. So nature connection practices, energy practices, ways that they can work with their parts and their shadow when it comes up. So yeah, so those are some of the keys, I'd say. The secrets, but they're not really secret, but they're maybe a little bit under the surface, that make a really successful vision quest.
And that really highlights the complexity and the depth of the whole experience. And actually the experience isn't that 4 days and 4 nights. It is far more than that. And actually that it could almost be like, he talks about how it's a rite of passage. It could be a lifetime preparation to get to that vision quest, so that you can then really, really sink into the experience and all that comes. And I remember a conversation that we've had where during one of your immersions, the hollow bone was a really significant moment. And it would just be really great if you could maybe just talk us through, because on a level like hollow bone, like 2 words, a construct like ball, and actually there's a real deep significance to you in that and that lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think, as you ask me that question, or give me that invitation to share, the difference that, the words hollow bone, anybody can hear that, and people might have a kind of relationship to that, or understand maybe what it means in certain situations. But the way that we own that will be really different for each of us. And for some of us, that might go really deep, and for others, it might just be a surface level understanding. And I think that that's fundamentally important in terms of what we're talking about here, about the deeper shifts, is that it is exploring our own truth to whatever comes up. So this was an experience that I had last year, and it was the final vision quest as part of my guide training. So to become a vision quest guide, we had a vision quest coming into the training, and then a vision quest coming out of the training. And so our teacher, a guy called Cader Brown, who's based in North Carolina, he had organized for us to have this quest next to Mount Shasta, which is in Northern California, and as kind of known as a very spiritual mountain by the local indigenous people there. So we were lucky enough to find some land where we could go out, and there's a group, probably about 6 of us, and we all went out and had our own solo experience. And this was after you know, having done a number of 24-hour quests and vision quests, and even 2 years ago, I did a 28-day solo out in Sweden. So I've had a lot of deep immersive experiences, and yet there was something about this quest that somehow went much deeper. So in the lead up to it, there had been certain things that had been showing up. And, you know, in nature connection, in shamanism, the word tracking is often used. And it's sort of this idea that we keep track of what we're noticing. And so I'd been noticing a few different things. One had been that I had kept coming across bones. So in the lead up, in the kind of few days before we started the quest, in random places as well, I've been finding bones. And so I was just noticing that, you know, it was a little bit out of the ordinary. It was showing up as something to track in my field. The other thing is that the night before we all came together as a group, I'd been walking through the town of Mount Shasta, which is a very small town. And as I was coming back to the Airbnb I was staying in, it was, you know, the sun had set, it was dusk, and this deer just literally walked down the road and stopped next to me. And it was a very bizarre experience. It felt really sort of somehow out of context. I mean, sure, we were right next to nature, but for it to just walk into town and sort of hang out peacefully next to me felt a little strange. And the third thing that I had been tracking was that a few of the other people in our group had been finding hawk feathers just sort of lying around. And there was I guess my ego mind had been a little jealous of that, right? Of people finding their hawk feathers. And so I was really aware that I, at some level, had this desire to find a hawk feather for myself. So that's the sort of setup, I guess, going into the quest. And then on day 4, which is really, I find, when my mind's opening up and I'm going deep, I reconnected in the morning to my intention, which was to bring Vision Quest to other people in the world. And my question, which is, how do I do that? How do I bring the Vision Quest to other people? And so I had one of these decks of oracle cards, and I shuffled them, and I was sitting with that intention, that question, and I picked one of the cards, and the card was the hollow bone card. Okay, and the significance of the hollow bone is usually that instead of us bringing our will and our way of doing things, we try to open ourselves up to kind of universe or spirit or the bigger picture or intuition, whatever we call it, where we allow something else to move through us and to kind of guide us. So I picked this card, the hollow bone card, and then I was sitting there probably around lunchtime, although, you know, obviously we weren't eating, so it was just, and we don't have watches either, so it's just tracking the sun. And this red-tailed hawk came and landed in a tree right next to where I was sitting, and it made a big deal out of showing off its feathers, you know. So it was kind of really opening up its wings, its tail, and it was like it was teasing me about this hawk feather thing that had been running through my mind. And then after a few minutes, it took off from the tree and it landed on the ground on the other side of the field where I was sitting. And I didn't see where it went after that. But there was enough intrigue in me that I wanted to go over and see, you know, maybe this hawk had left me a feather. So, and I think my ego mind was getting quite excited about that possibility. So I went over, and where the hawk had landed, there wasn't a feather, there were no feathers, but there was one hollow deer bone just sitting there on the ground. And it was obviously a deer bone because there was it was the right size. Those are the only other animals, big animals that are around that area. So now, you know, this bone, the hollow bone, the hawk, the deer had all sort of come together in this moment. And so I picked up the deer bone, and it was obvious to me there was something important about that, about connecting to this concept of hollow bone. And then that evening, it was my last night, and in the Vision Quest tradition that I've learned, we create a purpose for circle at dusk, and then we stay in that circle. It's kind of a 6-foot circle that's marked out by the directions, and we stay in that all night until sunrise, until we get drummed back to come back to the village, as it were. And so I just set up my purpose for circle and sat down and was, starting to meditate. And I heard a sound behind me, and a family of 4 deer walked past me into this field I was sitting in and made their bed for the night, just a few meters away from where I was. And we all spent the night together in this field. And I think, there's a lot of story that I could create around this, and ideas and what does it mean. But the most important thing for me was that in response to my question, which is how do I bring the Vision Quest to other people in this world, I felt this very deep understanding or recognition that it is about me showing up as a hollow bone, and just allowing myself to be guided somehow by the universe and not having a fixed idea of how this is going to work out. And that still sits in me really deeply. It's still a very deep knowing and understanding of that's my path. And I guess that was, what I mean about this. It's not a surface level thing. It does go a lot deeper, and it's shifted me fundamentally. We'll see for how long, but certainly it feels like it's shifted my approach to life.
That's great, Tom. And I imagine I'm going to have this image that listeners and watchers of this of having so many thoughts as I'm having, and I would encourage all of us to continue to sit with those thoughts that you might be having right now, having listened to Tom, because I think that will be really useful for everyone. And I think what comes from me from that, Tom, in the hollow bone is first of all, I think there's this, we talk about connection, in this podcast, and, you've really brought that out, is unless we notice, and it's interesting, the sort of indigenous shamanistic kind of points around tracking. I find that interesting. My curiosity's underlined that word. But for me as well, that seems to mean something around connection and noticing, having that nature connection to notice. And I'm sure many of us will have stories where we've been in nature and maybe we've noticed a particular animal, as you rightly say, something is happening on a frequent basis. And there is interest and there is curiosity in that. And there is a shift in what does that mean. And I love then the way you've connected that, and then the deer come back in. And there's some sort of guidance, as you say, going on around, but hollow bone, your connection to that is you're guiding us. Are you a pathfinder? I'm intrigued by all of this. There is something really lovely about it. And suddenly, from what we discussed earlier of being very spiritual and symbolic, which it is this work, but we're arriving at something that is very rational and is really meaningful to you, and I'm sure will be for many other of our listeners. And thank you for sharing that experience, because I think it brings so much richness to the work, what you've just shared. And I'm sure we'll get many comments and interest about that. I'm going to slightly shift you into some of the future. And really the next question really is, I'm certainly curious, and I know Anna Marie and many of the listeners will be too. I'm going to shift you to what's the future plans to developing this offering moving forward. I'm just fascinated to hear where it's going, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And you're right, just to touch very briefly on what you said there, there's this synchronicities that show up and they're quite unexplainable. And then there's a process of integration of how do we actually put language to it and make sense of it. and so that we can bring it into the world. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. You know, now I'm figuring out, well, how do I bring this the vision quest to other people? And what I've realized, we talked about earlier, you know, what makes a successful vision quest is that there are stages to it. So what I'm creating, or what I have created and I'm starting to offer now, are those stages that lead up to the vision quest, really. And so those are around understanding how we can get some kind of mastery of our inner world. Okay. So I put together a group online experience which dives into that. How do we work with our parts? How do we work with our emotions? How do we work with the challenging stuff that shows up? Because that stuff shows up during a vision quest, and if we get too thrown by it, it actually knocks us off our ability to be present to what's going on. Something else that I'm going to be offering is again online, because it's practical workshops, is around the medicine wheel and the 4 directions, because that's really important part of sort of indigenous wisdom. And I won't talk too much about that, but people can find out about that on my website. And then the other piece, obviously, that's important here is of offering the actual Vision Quest experience, which is going to be, to begin with, very tailored to whoever wants to show up and get involved in this. So it will probably be an 8 or 9 day experience. I have a few different locations that I will take people to, depending on what it is that they really want. And at the moment, what I'm really looking for is people who are interested in exploring this practice, and who are ready to co-create that with me. So I will guide them through the preparation, and giving them the tools, and then supporting them to go out for the 4 days and 4 nights, and then to come back and have that reintegration, and to kind of try to understand what happened while they were out there, and how they take that forward as a vision in their own life.
And thank you for sharing those different ways that you are currently moving forwards with this, and the fact that actually, like, sometimes when you think about vision quests, it's like, ooh, maybe a little bit. I mean, for me, it's like 4 days, 4 nights in the wilderness. There's a lot of preparation. That's a huge commitment kind of going into that. And the way that you've broken it down into the online offerings first to shape and then to lead, so that then actually the vision quest in itself is accessible. So anyone who is listening and watching, and this is something that has piqued your interest, like, reach out to Tom and have a conversation and see what is possible. And we get a lot of coaches or people who are interested in kind of coming into the coaching world as to, well, how do they find their space? How do they create their niche? And the way that you're co-evolving, co-creating is just a really insightful way that will hopefully encourage others as well to, take whatever it is, whether it's vision questing or, whatever modality or approach. And then how do you ultimately move forwards from, yes, whether it's a development perspective, whether it's more of a business perspective, because it's a part of your journey. And ultimately you're not alone. It's with the support and in co-creation and collaboration and relationship with others and with nature. I'd like to change track just slightly. And this is, the Vision Quest, we could keep on talking. It's such a rich, and there's so much depth. And there's also another part, the fact that you're a Brit, you're living in Chamonix, you've had connection to the valley for several years. Anyone who's listening in probably knows that it's a place very, very close to my heart, as well as my mountain home. But you live there more full time. You've also qualified as your IML, your International Mountain Leader. And this is just something from like a practical perspective of working in France and being able to ultimately to take people outdoors. And clearly has a huge impact with your vision quests as well. It's like a practicality to enable it to happen, particularly if you're working in the mountains. So just interested in hearing a bit about that experience. What does it bring to your practice, and ultimately that ability to be autonomous in the mountains?
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings different things in terms of that. So one of the things that you maybe sort of hinted at there is, because I'm living and working in France, there's quite a lot of bureaucracy and rules actually about what qualifications we need to be able to take people out into the mountains. So here we have to be qualified as an international mountain leader, and for that qualification to be recognized by the French authorities. So I actually did the French equivalent of the IML training, partly because actually I love taking people out, and guiding them on trekking trips through the mountains, but partly because it gives me legitimacy and also credibility to take people out into the mountains to do this deeper work. What it also gives me is a level of comfort around sort of group dynamics and actually the physical moving in the mountains with groups of people. And I think that, especially when weather comes into it and difficult terrain, there's something for me anyway that feels really important, that I've had a really solid training to be able to do that, totally aside from the coaching and the spiritual and the vision quest side of things. And then probably the final piece is around safety. So I have the IML, but I'm also qualified as a wilderness first responder. So knowing, what to do if something does go wrong in the environment and how to keep people safe. I probably would have been a bit blasé about that before I did my trainings. And now I'm very happy that I've done that, and I feel more comfortable.
Well, that's great. And Tom, it's such a good point for many of our listeners, people who maybe their intention is to work outdoors, maybe they're perhaps at the early stages of this type of work. And it just reminds us, whether we're in the Alps with the more extreme elements of weather, or we're in the UK, we still have a duty of care to look after our clients and those people that we work with around, and so it's really nice to bring that out as we come towards the end of our podcast today. But it's important, and we would, all of us would agree that those are important things for us to look at. So that's brilliant, and yeah, it's good to know that you've got all those skills as well, which is fantastic. So we're coming towards the sort of latter part now, Tom, of the podcast, and it's just been immensely rich. What resources could we always ask all of our guests to? Do you have a few resources that you could recommend to our listeners and watchers? Particularly interested in the Vision Quest, or how could they gain some more information or training or knowledge?
Yeah. And it's such an important question. Before I did my Vision Quest guide training, I spent a long time trying to find a teacher and a mentor that I thought I would be able to connect with, somebody who really balanced the practical aspects, how to put up a tarp and all of that stuff, with the much deeper spiritual stuff and how to be in relationship with all of that. So I've mentioned some of those, the teachers and the mentors that I've worked with already. There's two books that I would really recommend. So the first one is called The Roaring of the Sacred River, and that's by the kind of grandfather and grandmother of the kind of modern Western Vision Quest, really, Stephen Foster and Meredith Little, who set up the School of Lost Borders. So they were really introduced the first of the kind of new generation of Vision Quest guides, really, to this very old tradition. So that's an amazing book. So the roaring of the sacred river. And then the second one is called The Earth Caretaker Way. And that's by a guy called Tim Corcoran. And I'd really recommend that. It goes deeply into nature connection practices, but really from a deep indigenous kind of perspective. He's been mentored by some amazing Native American teachers. So yeah, the Earth Caretaker Way.
Thank you for sharing those 2 books, and we will have them on your episode page on the website. So listeners, watchers, feel free to check them out. So most importantly, where can people get in touch with you and reach out?
So very simple, either through my website, which is coachingwithtom.com, or by email, simply tom@coachingwithtom.com.
And I know that you're also quite active on LinkedIn and Instagram as well, sharing details of your various adventures and courses that have coming up. So we can get them linked on your website page as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And, I'd love to hear from anybody who's interested in this or wants to work with me or just wants to ask me questions about anything that we've talked about. So you're right, either through the website, the email, or LinkedIn would probably be the best ways.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And definitely we'd encourage all of our listeners and watchers to reach out to Tom. As he says, be happy to take any further questions or interest that you may have. And thank you very much to all of our listeners and watchers for taking the time to listen to another episode of Coaching Outdoor Podcast. Thank you, Tom, for joining us today from Chamonix in France, which is wonderful. It's lovely to see you. And we're coming towards in Series 8, towards the end, and there's a few more to go. And, please try and dip into some of our past episodes if you haven't had a chance. And as I say, it's all there on our website, and you can find us on LinkedIn as well. We are busy, Anna Marie and myself, in continuing as we come to 2025. And Happy New Year to everybody from us at the podcast. But we are getting busy to get ready for Coaching Outdoor Live. We would remind all of our listeners that we are having a 2-day live in-person event on the 19th and 20th of June. So please put that into your diary if you haven't already. And we are really looking forward to seeing everybody coming along to our event again this year. And we will continue to be back with further podcasts, and other wonderful guests such as Tom. And enjoy listening. And we thank you very much for your time and taking the time to listen to us. Thank you.
And just a quick last request. So if you have enjoyed this episode, please do spread the word. We are really trying to get this out across the coaching world to encourage more people to take their practice outdoors. So whether that is simply liking on Spotify, leaving a comment on iTunes, reposting it across the LinkedIn world, we really, really want to get more reach so more people find out about the knowledge and the practice of our amazing guests that we have on. We are nearly at 2,000. Maybe by the time this is aired at the end of January, we will have 2,000 LinkedIn members in our community space, which is absolutely phenomenal. So all we can do is really, really thank you for that. So again, if you're not a member yet of the LinkedIn community, do come and hunt us out. We're really on an amazing growth trajectory, and that is all thanks to you, dear listener. So a big, big, big thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopes to catch up soon. Chamonix side in the mountains. And have a fabulous day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure for me. Thanks to both of you. And I'm definitely going to join your LinkedIn community. So
if you enjoyed what you've heard, like it, share across your network,
and subscribe to our YouTube channel and LinkedIn community page, the Coaching Outdoor Podcast.
Thanks so much in advance for your support.